us. With that, we have a one item agenda. It's a special meeting, so we don't have general public comment for a special meeting. So let's go ahead and first take up item 1.
Item number 1 is a Business Tax Advisory Committee and Blue Sky Consulting Group to report relative to the phase-out of the gross receipts tax.
Okay. Do we have any public comment cards on this today? Do we have any public? Okay. If I can ask the members of BTAC to come forward to the table. We got to keep meeting like this. Yes, so for those who've been following this, there's actually some interesting developments here. We have reached out to Blue Sky Consulting, and I know the CAO did as well, and there's some a little page and a half report, thank you, that we have before us from the CAO. But I think a lot of the contention between the original BTAC and City Commission study of Professor Swenson and the second from the Office of Economic Analysis follow-up request was really revolved around the idea of how elastic a change in taxes was to both jobs and economic output. In other words, how much of a reduction of taxes led to what percentage increase in economic activity, jobs, and ultimately taking that economic activity and figuring out how much city revenue we got, what's the net for the city? How much did we lose by reducing our gross receipts tax, and how much did we gain in other taxes that came around as a part of the increased economic output? When we had the Swenson study, it was quite a large multiplier. I think it was the creation of it was revised 115, was it in the end? 1,000?
That is correct.
115,000 jobs.
119,000.
119, thank you. And a net increase of revenue to the city. The Blue Sky study had a quite different, almost, I think it was 9-to-1 loss in terms of revenues for the city, though it did acknowledge as well. It was the second study that acknowledged positive job growth and positive net economic activity. But they based that on, and I don't mean to take your speech away here, but I want to just frame it. They based that on 2 studies. The most recent was a kind of analysis of previous studies, which was now 15 years old, very different world, very different environment. But the first one, which was really the foundation, the Bartek study, when we then looked at it ourselves afterwards, found some different, a range of different measures of elasticity. So if I haven't lost you yet, in other words, in plain English, we found out that in that study, which was the foundation for where they got their calculations, there was actually a whole range of different and more positive economic benefits that comes from tax reductions in the same book that they were studying, and for whatever reason that wasn't in the study. So we've reached out to Blue Sky and asked, why that was. And I think it may be predicated on a couple misunderstandings or lack of data for this time and place. One, that the model is not one of interstate commerce when we look at reducing taxes and competitiveness between states, that they may have relied on measures that compare that sort of environment instead of more of a suburban model, which is what Los Angeles faces, which is one in which we're really competing for a lot of these businesses that we have here with a Vernon, with a Glendale, with a Culver City, not with a Texas per se, though they have both. And then the second thing is just the changed world around us and how commerce has become increasingly mobile, the explosion of the internet and what that has done. And it surprises me, which both Blue Sky and Swenson were hindered by, that in 15 years, given the amount of work that's done with tax policy at the local level, that nobody has done an updated study from the academic world. And certainly I think there must be an enterprising professor out there or a PhD student who wants to do their thesis on something pretty useful. I would say it would be useful to update some of this data for the new world that we're in. But with that, why don't we hear BTAC met following the Blue Sky Office of Economic Analysis report on the 16th, and we have Chair Lloyd Greif and our great member Mel Cohen here as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to you and let me know what you came up with.
Good morning. Thank you,
Good morning.
Mr. Chairman. So we did meet earlier this week. We had met a couple of weeks prior to that and actually had met with both Professor Swenson and two representatives of Blue Sky Consulting Group, the two who were responsible for the report, and questioned both of them. We then did our own independent research, including reading the primary literature cited by Blue Sky in their work, which was a compilation of about 57 different studies by Timothy Bartik, entitled Who Benefits from State and Local Economic Development Policies. And it was clear in that review that there was, as you have just encapsulated, there was some selective quoting from that study, and Blue Sky, I think, missed the very specific characteristics of Los Angeles and its surrounding jurisdictions. And the analysis that they did was more based on, let's say, moving from San Francisco to Los Angeles than it would be moving from Pasadena to Los Angeles. And that's a huge difference. So net, we've revisited our analysis and our recommendations, and what I presented to you in writing, I'm going to walk you through quickly, is where we've come out based on our extensive deliberations.
Just for the public, for anybody who may be listening in or watching, is this on any website yet, or?
It is not. We will, upon a conclusion of this meeting, we will provide you for posting a.
We'll get that up on PDF either through our cd13.com website or through the City Council website.
Yes, we'll get you electronic copies. This is hot off the press, so to speak.
And we'll make sure it's included in the council file, which is another way that folks can get it. Okay.
So what is contained in this report was voted on by BTAC on Monday and unanimously approved by BTAC. We had a 100% attendance in that meeting. And so this is our current recommendation. This supersedes all prior recommendations. I'm going to take you through it. Page 2 talks about the fact that the gross receipts tax is not market, so to speak, in this jurisdiction. And we think part of the problem associated with the fact that there's extremely high unemployment here in the city.
Here, we get you up here right there. Thank you.
Here in the city, roughly 13.5% versus, which is 18% higher than the state of California, and the city is also 51%, more than half as much as the country. So, and underemployment is approaching 20%. Why is that? So we try to, over the last 2.5 years, we've looked at why. And one of the things, if you go to page 3, is you'll note that although population has grown in the city, jobs have not. Jobs have shrunk in the city. Whereas, if you say, okay, is that a Southern California problem? Is that an LA County problem? The answer is no, that's not an LA County problem. It's an LA City problem. Because in point of fact, in the LA County, population has grown and jobs have grown. So what are we doing wrong? If you go to page 4, we don't think it has anything to do with the city itself in terms of the various assets that the city has, its skilled workforce, the universities, the airport, the port, municipality, et cetera. So it's not really that. What is it? And what we think is it's this disparate gross receipts tax that the city has. It's roughly 10 times higher than the average for any of the other 87 cities in the county. And I'm on page 5 now. Mm-hmm. Since this is a 39-page report, I'm going to go at a pretty good clip. I would ask members of the Jobs Committee to interrupt with questions at any point. Okay. So this business tax is a part of the cost of doing business, and it raises the cost of doing business in the city. If you go to page 6, this just lays out the fact that we do have the highest tax rate of any of the competing jurisdictions. This is a comparison to the highest bracket, 0.507, which is professions and occupations. We'll talk about that catch-all category in a moment. And you can see how that stacks up. With the exception of Santa Monica and Culver City, it towers above every other municipal jurisdiction. Page 7, it also towers above any other major metropolitan area. And for companies that are thinking about locating in a major metropolitan area, it might explain why we have less Fortune 500 than a city like Denver, for example. So page 7 looks at the 15 largest U.S. cities. And page 8 looks at other major metros, and again, it shows that we're way ahead of the pack in a very undistinguished perspective in terms of the business tax. Page 9 talks about the fact that the business tax has been in place for 76 years, this gross receipts tax, rather, and it goes back to when the economy was very much a manufacturing economy. You can see a statistic there. The most recent ones is an estimate provided by LADC earlier this earlier this year. It shows that the service economy has gone from less than 15% to approximately 53% in that time frame, whereas manufacturing has shrunk from roughly a third to less than 10%. Page 10. So the point is, the gross receipts tax and the classifications that we have here in the city, and there are 9 different classes, there are 6 different brackets of taxation. These are all an anachronism. These are all a millstone around the neck of the city, and we believe it has everything to do with the fact that we have extremely high unemployment here, and it's not responsive to the way the economy has changed. It's not responsive to the mobile nature of the economy today, the service nature, what has come on with the onset of the internet and how that's changed business. We're just behind the times in a nutshell. So if you go to page 11, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that major category. And I'm being joined now on my left by Michael Banner, also a member of, esteemed member of BTEC. So welcome, Michael. So on page 11, this highest bracket, which is professions and occupations, is a catch-all. What do I mean by catch-all? What that means is if you can't find the right classification, there's some very specific descriptions of these other 8 classifications. Guess what? By default, you land in class 9. Why is that a problem? Well, class 9 is the highest rate, coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally. So if you look at page 11, since 2004 through now, if you look at all the other classifications, in terms of number of taxpayers that have been put into those classifications, they have grown by 4.2% compounded annually. CAGR means compounded annual growth rate. That's an acronym. Mm-hmm. Class 9 has grown by more than double that rate, 9.4%. So this very tellingly tells you that, A, it clearly is a catch-on. A lot of businesses are ending up there by hook or by crook. And it also maybe says that we continue to be increasingly a service economy.
One thing on here, if I just may interrupt real quick. So since 2004, 2005, over a 6-year period, the number of accounts grew from approximately 280,000 to north of 400,000. That's pretty phenomenal growth in the number of accounts. Is that just part of what we did in terms of cracking down and making sure that the Office of Finance was looking at state records and who was and was not registered with the city, in your opinion, or was it a combination of that and growth of new businesses?
I think it's clearly, you're referring to
just
overall,
the growth overall. Like I'm on page 11, I'm looking at the left hand, says number of accounts. That's the number of accounts with the city, I assume?
That's correct. That's
so,
number of accounts
and
with the city.
At the beginning, it's at 280,
yeah, so
and it goes up to 400 and, 20, something like that?
The Office of Finance has definitely played a more significant role as cop on the beat in terms of its discovery processes and discovering more businesses out there. So because of that, it blurs it from the perspective of knowing what it relates to business departure versus, business attraction.
Yeah. Okay.
But for sure, they've taken their enforcement up a notch, a significant notch. You can see that the other thing is that now Class 9 accounts for the number of taxpayers has risen from roughly 36% of total taxpayers in 2005 in Class 9 to 43%, and the payments to the city coming from Class 9 has gone from 56% to 59%. So almost 60% of the gross receipt revenues the city receives come from Class 9, which is a problem because, again, that is by far a much higher bracket than any other. So you go to page 12, we're saying that it talks about effectively trying to track manufacturing jobs. Just isn't going to happen. I hate to say that. Truly, it pains me to say that, but we are in the state of California. We do have, the most highly regulated state for those types of jobs to begin with. And we got OSHA issues, environmental issues, labor laws, high state income tax, licensing and permitting issues, et cetera. It's much easier to track the service business, and service businesses are extremely mobile and don't require much in terms of permit approvals, right? You're not talking about making a major investment or breaking ground or building a complex manufacturing facility. The services companies consume less city services than manufacturing and real estate-based businesses, so logically you'd think they'd be taxed less and in point of fact are taxed more. So they use less of the city services, and yet we're gouging them, in a nutshell. And this is an issue that we feel is crying for relief. It's crying for help. So if you go to page 13,
Can I ask,
now this is,
can I ask
yes,
a question?
Councilmember
On
Parks.
page 11.
Page 11.
Yeah, on that chart, I'm just trying to figure out, when we look at the 4.2 overall, and we're talking about number of accounts.
That's number of accounts, sir.
Okay. Does that have any relationship to the amount of gross income that the businesses may have?
No, sir, it's just accounts.
Okay, I mean, what I'm trying to figure out is that when we say that the 9.4 or the Class 9 has grown the most significant, is there any relationship to these figures in that we drew a line, I think at 500,000 you pay no gross receipt tax, and also in your first 3 years that you don't pay any? I mean, does that have any correlation as to why the 9.4 growth in the classification 9? Are these the people that are actually paying taxes versus those who are in the non-pay category?
These are ones reporting, to my knowledge. I mean, that's more of an Office of Finance question, but the point of fact, these are actual reporting businesses, or
Okay,
it could be
I'm trying to
different
find
facility, it could be...
Are any of these, is there any correlation with the amount of gross receipts they're paying? Are the classification 9, are those people that are normally paying because they're making over 500,000? Are the people that are at the other 8 classes are making less than $500,000?
It's a good point. I think what you're asking is, have they just registered and not paying because they're under the threshold, or are they above the threshold? And I don't think you have that data, but I think it would be very interesting for us to get that from Office of Finance, and because I looked at this and had a couple related questions, and maybe we can ask them to come and report, so we get a sense of where the businesses are heading. Is it just the crackdown? Because we need to see, and Professor Swenson did this. The reason I asked the question is he said taxes went down and receipts went up. Now, we know that, but as I've asked in here before, that could be a combination of a more business-friendly environment and better enforcement. And certainly SB 60 helped us look at the state books to know what businesses were there, and look suddenly at the city books and say, wait a second, a bunch of these aren't registered, and send them letters. So I think getting that data might be interesting. I don't know, Mel, if you having from the previous incarnation, if you remember any of that work or any of those statistics, but it may not be BTAC's ability to parse those numbers as well as Office of Finance.
This may address a little bit what you're asking, Mr. Parks, but the class, if you're asking, net is Class 9 contributing more? Is Class 9 paying more taxes over the last 6 years today than they did 6 years ago? The answer is absolutely. If you look at the footnote, if you look at the bullet point at the bottom, it says that Class 9 was paying less than 56%. It's now paying 59% of the total gross receipts received by the city.
But I think it still is the question as to, are they in Class 9 because of the gross receipts they are reporting versus those businesses that are making less than $500,000 and not paying any taxes, or those businesses that are new to the city in the first 3 years that are not paying any tax?
They're in Class 9 based on the nature of the business that they are and whether they fit into any of the other 8 classifications, sir.
Right.
So that's based not on the amount of revenues that they have, it's based on what the nature of the business is. And the problem with Class 9 is it's a catch-all category, so if you don't fit tightly into these other definitions, you land in Class 9. Or you land in Class 8, miscellaneous services, coincidentally also at 0.507 tax rate. So I'm already done with page 12. Page 13 talks about the connection between lower business taxes, increasing economic activity, which thereby increases other revenue streams. And more businesses create greater demand for commercial properties, which drives prices up. Same thing for real estate, residential real estate in terms of more employees. That in turn has a direct correlation to higher property tax receipts. More businesses means more employees, means greater purchasing power, higher sales tax receipts, and on down the line. Class 9 also, by the way, is a hand-in-glove fit because of the fact these are better-paying jobs. These are higher-quality jobs you're talking about. Many of these jobs are in the emerging technology space. It's a hand-in-glove fit with some of the world-class universities we have at USC and UCLA and Caltech. Page 14, I'm going to skip page 14, 15, and 16. And 17, you already know who we are at BTAC. That's for people that might read this report who don't know who we are. You don't qualify. Page 18 talks about the fact we've been out and about here for 2.5 years, 35 meetings, and multiple meetings around that with other interest groups within the city, including economists. Page 19 talks about some of our other reform measures up to this point. Again, I want to skip that. That's not the purpose of this presentation. Page 20 is talking about what's the goals of business tax reform. And first and foremost, spur job creation. The business tax, the gross receipts tax, is a job killer. And we believe strongly that city government needs to put that job killer behind bars where it belongs. Take it off the streets. Achieve simplification, increase compliance, increase transparency as well, and the tax base. And if you reduce, we think that will increase the tax base. Make it both predictable and fair, and diminish the controversy, of which there's considerable. And put to bed once and for all people's thinking that LA is not worker and business friendly. Page 21. It talks about, and you'll see our recommendations, which I'm about to come to. We think that there are recommendations will bring the tax code into alignment with the reality of a 21st century, highly mobile, service-based economy versus the manufacturing-based one of the past century. If you go to page 22, this talks about also improving the quality of life for workers here in Los Angeles, because we think this is going to induce private sector employment, and that will, of course, bring back more significant corporate employers, which will in turn, the city will reap the benefits across, including from philanthropy. And we think this will have a very significant impact on the quality of life here in the city. Page 23. Reducing taxes will spur growth in economic activity and revenues. There is no leap of faith here. This is not uncharted territory. This city has done this at the earlier last decade. In fact, Chairman Garcetti, you're very familiar with this. This was part of, and as you are, Mr. Parks, as well, and as the entire city council is, and the mayor, you implemented a 5-year, 3% a year, 15% reduction across the board in the level of business taxation. What happened when you did that? What happened when you did that is business tax receipts grew 21%. General fund revenues grew 23%. And the number of taxpayer accounts grew 44%, from 329,000 to 473,000. Now, part of that, again, is discovery, but the long and the short of it is there's clearly an impact here that says when you reduce business taxes, you didn't net lose revenues to the city. You gained revenues to the city. And so that's what that graphic shows. The red bars are the total of the general fund and its performance during this period of time, during the period of the phase out of the reduction of the business tax. And the blue line shows the actual business tax receipts. If you go to page 24, both Dr. Swenson and Blue Sky, despite their disagreements, agree on one very important fact. They both agree that reducing business taxes will increase economic activity, jobs, and other indirect revenues. They both say that very clearly in their report. And in fact, both of them relied on this individual, Tim Bartik, and his work. And I'm going to quote from his work, because this, unfortunately, is where I think Blue Sky went wrong.
Is this from page 43?
This is the famous page 43, okay, which Mr. Garcetti is familiar with because I have spoken with him separately. It states on that page that if a given small suburban jurisdiction within a metropolitan area, and for example, and this is our example, Los Angeles within LA County, raises its business taxes by 10%, it can expect in the long run a reduction in business activity by from 10% to 30%. That's huge. And the other point is that Bartek and Blue Sky based their analysis, since Blue Sky based it on Bartek and Wazilenko, which also based it on Bartek, all of their studies that they looked at were conducted in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. What in 1950s to 1980s did we have an internet-driven economy? We did not. And Bartek says, and I didn't quote it here, but Bartek says that the most recent studies, the ones that occurred in 1980, are the ones that show greater pronounced effects and impacts along these lines, greater than what the other studies showed. So when he averages all those studies, he's actually understating. He's understating with this 10 to 30% what the impact would be. And what Blue Sky did not look at is they didn't look at a situation of Los Angeles versus, basically an inter-metropolitan situation. They looked at intra-metropolitan situation, moving from one part of the state, like Northern California to Southern California, or moving from out-of-state to in-state. They did not look at, moving across the street from Los Angeles to Burbank. And as a result of that, they missed it totally.
Let's stop here for a second, because this is, I think, the core of much of what you are going to be arguing today and what we've seen in that study. When they looked at it, they were looking at the inverse, not what a raise in business tax would do to reduce business activity. They were looking at a reduction of business tax would do to spur business activity. But the way the elasticity works, and I don't know enough about the model to say it's correct or not, but they're looking at it. It works the same amount up or down.
Yes,
in other words,
does.
it doesn't proportionally change because a reduction doesn't have a bigger bang for the buck in that direction than an increase does in the opposite direction.
That is correct.
But here, this would be a multiplier. They were saying, high end was they were saying somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2 was their high end. This, if you looked at that elasticity, would be what level?
1.0 to 3.0. So a difference of 10 to, if you take their 0.1, they fell out at 0.2.
From 5 to 30 times, let's say, right? If they took the 0.2.
So if they're at
0.10.
0.2, it would be 15 times, right? So it would be 5 times 0.2 would be 10, would be to 1.0.
Right. To 30 at the high end.
15, sorry.
So
5 to 15 times.
if we're
15
taking
times,
the
15
1,
times
if we're
0.2.
taking the 0.1 and going up to 3.
correct.
So I'm just saying,
Correct.
if we take the full range of both, it's
Correct.
somewhere between
Yes.
5 and 30 times
Yes,
more.
absolutely. Understated by them. Okay. Absolutely. And that makes a huge difference. The other thing to note is Swenson did do his own empirical research. He didn't just rely on the text. He did perform his own analysis based on the 2001 and 2007 tax reductions tied to the size of business and new business, the size of businesses specifically. We're basically putting aside Swenson, and we're putting aside Blue Sky, because they're so disparate and they disagree they don't disagree on terms that there's going to be an economic benefit. They disagree on the magnitude of it. Who's to say which one is exactly right and which one's wrong? We have concerns clearly about the work done by Blue Sky, and we went to the source material to do our own research in that regard, and that's where our concerns emanate from.
Let me say one other thing, because this is also important in the core. The only thing that also isn't spelled out here, and I don't know if it's spelled out in the study, it just says raises its business taxes by 10%. Now, that doesn't say increases a business's cost by 10%, because business taxes are already at different levels around the country. So for me, what's difficult to understand is, let's take two scenarios here. Let's say City A has a business tax of 1 penny on $1 million. It's extremely low, basically almost nothing. Another one has a business tax of $10,000 on every $1 million of receipts. What this says is, either way, cut that penny 10% and you're going to boost economic activity by 10 to 30%. That's improbable, right? So the level of the tax that you're actually reducing must be a factor in this as well.
Yes, and what you look at here, and that's why this is so important, that the study be Los Angeles, that it have been Los Angeles, because in LA we have such a dramatic increase, such a dramatic difference, forget increase, decrease, such a dramatic difference between the level of taxations in the city, in our fair city, and the other 87 cities. It is It's not a close call. It's not a 10% difference. It's a 10 times difference. And because of that, there's extreme sensitivity to it. And it's extremely visible, and it does cause, based on the research that we performed and the focus groups that we held, it does cause businesses to say, we're not coming.
And I agree with that anecdotally. But there's others, and sometimes around this horseshoe, people say, look, it's not that big of a tax and that big of a factor. For instance, even if it was 10 times that penny and you had to pay 10 cents, say suddenly LA is in that scenario and the Burbank is the 1 penny on $1 million of receipts and we're 10 cents. Yeah, you could say it's 10 times more, but it's such a small amount of somebody's business costs. So we have to really, you and I think, agree. We've had a lot of anecdotal evidence, but a lot of other people say, look, a lot of businesses don't bring that up with me. It's other things. It's our red tape. It's our lack of affordable housing that is a bigger driver.
So let's say the average business is making a 10% pre-tax margin. So they're making a 10% pre-tax margin. A 0.507% tax rate means that they're effectively
losing 0.5%.
Right? Yeah, it's very material to them. In fact, I'm going to hand this out. This was Dr.
So it becomes 5%, not 0.5%, is what you're saying.
I think that Professor Swenson actually covered that in his report where he gave the example of a business that generated $1 million in gross revenue. And I think the math was the gross receipts tax was equivalent to a 20% income tax.
Yeah, well, actually, he said, there's the document I'm handing out is Dr. Swenson did a response to, at our request, we asked him to respond to the work done by Blue Sky Consulting, and he sent me an email on Sunday prior to our meeting on Monday. We discussed it on Monday at BTAC, and I'm quoting for it. He says, first, the Los Angeles business tax is larger than it may appear, although it is only 0.5% of...
Hold on just
this
one
is
second.
directly to your...
Do we just have one copy of this? Did we just get one?
Here, you can...
Here's an... Oh, thank you. No, we got another one. I just want to make sure Mr. Parks has it. This is to
recap. This is from Dr. Swenson in response to a request from BTAC to respond to Blue Sky's report. And on page 2 of this brief memo from him, he says, and then he's questioning their elasticity conclusions, and he says midway in the first paragraph, first, the Los Angeles business tax is larger than it may appear. Although it is only 0.5% of sales, if this were translated into an income tax rate, assuming a company has a 10% profit margin, this would be equivalent to a 5% income tax, which is actually almost as much as many states' corporate income taxes. So it is extremely material.
Sorry, I'm just reading through this.
And that's 5% on top of whatever you pay in state and federal income tax.
Correct. So it is very material. We are talking, because this is a gross receipts tax, it is a huge issue. We know what type of economy we've had since the Great Recession started in the fourth quarter of 2007. There's a lot of businesses would love to have profits right now, and yet they're still writing a check every February to the city of LA.
Correct.
So I'm conscious of the time. We have 15 minutes. I want to get moving here. So if I can, I don't mean to turn off questions, but let me just try and accelerate.
Go ahead.
Page 25. This catch-all category is particularly concerning because most innovative new businesses, the entrepreneurial engines that fuel economic growth and preponderance of new jobs, end up so classified. Clean tech, emerging technologies, engineering, research and development. Research and development services, those are services. That's the kind of intellectual capital, that's the kind of high-paying job we want in this city. And we're not going to get them, and we're not going to keep them if we're taxing them at the highest rate. We're risking effectively taking our Silicon Beach and making it into a valley, but not a Silicon Valley, more like a Death Valley. If you go to, so what is our recommendation? Let's cut to the chase here. Page 26. We are recommending a 3-stage phase out of the business tax, but dealing 3 stages, just to be clear, over 15 years with triggers so that you can check the progress. And if you look on page 26, the first stage would be, and it's tax simplification. We have 9 classifications. There's a lot of gamesmanship potential to play those classifications and put somebody into a higher bracket. We've seen it happen in the multimedia space. We've seen it happen in the internet space. Let's end that game. So the first thing we're talking about doing is taking classes 7, 8, and 9 that are taxed at 0.315, 0.356, and 0.507, the most egregious tax rates. And over 5 years, collapse them all into Class 6. Class 6, which is 0.255. So we're talking specifically about taking 9 classes, covering 6 tax rates, and simplifying the code by initially taking those 9 classes down to 3 classes, covering 3 tax rates. So at the end of the 5-year period, you would have 0.101, Class 1, which would be wholesale category. You'd have 0.127, Class 2, which would be retail and media. And you'd have 0.255, Class 3, which would be services and professions. Tax at point. So that is the simplification. And then in the next stage, and this occurs, again, with metrics, so you can check to see if, in point of fact, you're gaining the revenues, and we'll talk about that in a second, to make up for what you're losing. The next stage, you would collapse Class 3 into Class 2. So you go from 3 classes to 2 classes, and so what does that mean? You'd take 0.255, and you'd cut it in half, so it would be 0.127, and at the end of 10 years, you'd have 2 classes, 0.101, 0.127, period. And then the next 5 years, years 11 through 15, guess what happens? Bye-bye gross receipts tax. It goes from 0.127 and 0.101 to 0. Why are we recommending this? We've just talked about why we're recommending this. We've talked about the fact that the gross receipts tax is a millstone around the city of Los Angeles. But we're talking about a very, we think, prudent and responsible way of addressing it, and signaling today that LA is open for business and putting Los Angeles back to work. If you go to page 27, this just gives you this kind of shows you in tabular form what I'm talking about, what we're talking about. Again, this is a unanimous recommendation of BTAC. Stage 1 says, you're looking at providing the relief initially to the categories, the classifications that need it most, the highest rates. And you can see on the before side of the ledger here the various classifications I talked about, including some of the other classifications that are also taxed at these high rates. And then on the right-hand side, you can see what the initial cut is after, this is what occurs after year 5. And at the bottom, it talks about, okay, what are we talking about? Then you'd have the new categories, wholesale, retail, and media, and services and professions. You can see the number of accounts in those classifications and the revenues that would come from them. So this is a gradual simplification and a gradual reduction that we think would minimize classification gamesmanship and substantially enhance the city's competitiveness with surrounding jurisdictions. Go to page 28. This talks about why we're talking about doing it in this order and addressing classes 7 and 9 initially and leaving 1 through 6 unchanged, because 1 through 6 is not where the most acute problem is right now and is not where the most mobile businesses are. Classes 1 through 6 have a lot of geography-based businesses that can't move, and that's what this page talks about. Class 3 includes office and commercial properties. They're tied to the city. Classes 4 and 5, retail stores and theaters, they're tied to the city. Classes 1 and 2, at this point, it's wholesale, but that's the lowest bracket. No reason to impact that initially. It's not the issue. Classes 6 through 9, that's the issue. Classes 7 through 9 particularly. If you go to page 29, how do we gauge the impact? So if we're saying we're reducing the level of taxation, what are we getting? And what we think we're getting, and what we'd want you to take a look at, we're talking about doing this prudently with a safety belt attached so nobody gets hurt, city doesn't get hurt. And this is designed to protect the city budget and ensure that revenue neutrality results from this. So what you would do is you would benchmark where we are right now. You'd set a base year for all of these categories. All of these categories you see on the bottom of page 29 are tied to economic activity. So business taxes, sales taxes, real and personal property taxes, utility taxes, license, permits and fees, transient occupancy taxes, documentary transfer taxes, parking users taxes, power revenue transfers, parking fines, residential development taxes, and other such fees. And so we think you look at that, and then what you do on page 30. So on page 30, you would first roll back. You'd implement this plan for the first 3 years, and what the net effect would be, and you'll see that on a graphic coming up, is that you would take you down from 0.507 down to the next bracket, which is 0.356. At that point, you then check to make sure that the cumulative reduction in taxes, in business taxes, is being made up for by all of these other revenue categories. And if it is, green light, you then go to years 4 and 5 and complete the implementation of this first stage. And then at the end of the 5th year, you then again benchmark it and see how you're doing. And this goes on throughout. So at the bottom of page 30, it says, the objective and expectation is that simplification from 9 classes to 3 initially, and then from 3 to 2, and then from 2 to 0, and a reduction, and you can see the various reductions, will be at worst revenue neutral and at best significantly revenue accretive. If you go to page 31, this is a graphic that kind of shows it. Green light, you're reducing. Red light, you're holding until the revenue gains catch up to the quote-unquote revenue losses, and then you continue again. Am I going too fast?
Nope, you're doing great.
Okay. Page 32, this lays out, so we have a table like this for each of the 3 stages. Stage 1, this is the consolidation of classes, the 5-year phase-in. And you can see where the red and green bars are is where you stop to take a measurement. And then you continue, and you can see the reduction across each one of these classes. And you'll note, of course, as you look at this stage 1, that nothing's changing as you go from year 1 to year 2 to year 3 to year 4 to year 5 in classes 1 through 6. But where you should focus your attention is classes 7, 8, and 9, and you can see where the changes occur. This has an impact of roughly $25 million a year to the city if you assume there's no revenue gain. We think there's going to be offsetting revenue gains based on the economic research and based on the economic research and based, frankly, on everything we know about the way the world works. You reduce business costs, you increase business activity. There is no leap of faith there. There's nobody that can question that. If you go to, if you look at page 33 shows you where the city stacks up right now in terms of the highest bracket. It is the highest taxed jurisdiction in LA County. After stage 1, we're no longer the lightning rod, we're no longer the highest tax, we're now the 3rd highest. So that's some improvement, right? Job's not done yet, because as you can tell, that's the top 15 brackets, and we moved from the number 1 spot to number 3 spot. We're still way above everybody else, with 2 exceptions. Page 34 says, let's not just look at the 15 highest, let's look at some of the meaningful competitors to the city. And you can see that it does make a material difference in terms of the difference, but we're still going to be higher than Pasadena, Long Beach, Burbank, Culver City, Hawthorne, Torrance, Glendale. So let's go on to stage 2, because the job's not done yet. Stage 2 talks about a 5-year reduction now in the new class 3 rate, cutting it in half, taking it from 0.255 down to 0.127. The same analysis, you can see how it works year by year, and you can see that you then take a breather at the end of year 8 and take another breather at the end of year 10 before you make a determination to go, no go, and consider. And if it turns out the revenue gains haven't kept pace with the business tax receipt losses, then what you do is you pause, let another year pass, and then take another look, and if it has caught up at that point, then you resume. So the quickest this would occur, and this is very important, the quickest this would occur would be 15 years. And if it turns out that there's more of a lag between revenue gains and revenue losses, then it would take longer than 15 years, but under no circumstances would it be shorter than 15 years. Page 36 shows what the competitive landscape looks like again at the end of stage 2, and now we're much more in the hunt. Now we're, Culver City is higher than us, Santa Monica, Inglewood, El Monte, San Fernando, and we're at 0.127, our highest bracket. It becomes probably less of a deciding factor for whether somebody locates or doesn't locate in the city of LA. We're not in the top 5, but we're just outside the top 5 highest tax jurisdictions. And again, on page 37, it shows that we're still higher than all of these other ones I mentioned before, like Pasadena, Long Beach, Burbank, et cetera, Glendale. And then finally, page 38, the last phase. And this is the phase where you say bye-bye gross receipts tax, and it goes from 0.127 and 0.101 down to 0. And we think throughout this entire period of significant and meaningful tax reform by the city of Los Angeles, the city will reap a public image bonanza for effectively being worker-friendly, business-friendly, for putting Angelenos back to work and saying LA is open for business. And the last page, 39, says where you're really being impacted by this catch-all category is small business. These businesses that start, and you're effectively pushing them out of the city by classifying them initially in the highest bracket. And that's not what you want to do, since 88% of net job creation is driven by small business.
Yep. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to be conscious of our time. I also want to thank Ed Cooper, who's here as well from the Office of Finance, and I think there's maybe some questions that both Mr. Parks and I have for a future moment. I mean, you feel free to come forward. Some of the work that is not in BTAC, nor was it their charge per se, is we're curious to look at, and I don't expect you to have it right offhand, but some of the things that we're curious about is the percentage of new accounts that has grown over the last 5 or 6 years quite dramatically, whether that came just from discovery, whether that came from new companies because of a more business-friendly environment, perhaps the value of the new accounts. We just had the number of the new accounts, as opposed to the overall value of of business tax receipts, which we do have. But are those numbers you guys have ever crunched, or could you? Is that something that if we were to put together a list, Mr. Park's office and mine, of just trying to understand and get our head around some of what happened when we did do our business tax reform, and then how many we discovered because we were comparing with state rolls, how many might have come because it was a more business-friendly environment, to try to disaggregate some of those out?
Sure. Ed Cabrera, Assistant Director, Office of Finance.
I'm sorry, I just called you Cooper. Cabrera.
Definitely, we can provide some additional information. And I do have some a broad overview. First of all, I do want to thank and acknowledge the members of the Business Tax Advisory Committee for their hard work and diligence. It has been a long road, 2.5 years almost, and Finance has been there along the way, providing support and information and data, as well as analysis. We also do want to thank the chair, Mr. Greif, for the acknowledgement in terms of Finance's discovery efforts. I do have overview of the approximately a 10-year overview with regards to essentially the inception of Office of Finance, and it mirrors the tenure of Ms. Cristoval as General Manager and the focus that the General Manager immediately put upon enforcement and discovery. And what's interesting to note that going back to fiscal year 2000-2001, the total business tax revenue that was generated by the city was approximately $343 million. That has grown over time to fiscal year 2010-11, which totaled $424 million. And certainly during the course of the past 10 years or so, we did have the prior BTAC 1 with Mr. Banner and Mr. Khan as members, and there were some very effective tax reform measures put into place which Finance implemented, such as the small business exemption and the new business exemption. However, as Mr. Greif correctly noted, much of the effort of Finance over the last 10 years has been focused on identifying businesses that are operating within the city of Los Angeles that are not registered. And as a key example, the AB 63 program, which you noted earlier in the meeting, was a key component. Program to date, the Office of Finance has identified over 150,000 businesses that were not registered. We've got them on the rolls, so not only did we identify money due at the time, but also on an ongoing basis.
So just to be clear on that, you account, so 100% of that growth that's on page 9, if that was, let's see, from 270 to about 410,000, so 140,000, or 100, maybe it's 150,000, 100% of those you ascribe to discovery and not to new businesses.
No, that's not what I'm saying. And let me finish.
Okay, sure.
The AB 60, that's an example. Also, program today, we've generated approximately $152 million solely from the AB 63 program. Office of Finance has a variety of other discovery programs, and that's just one small slice, one key example. But the point I was trying to make, going back to 2000-2001, 82% of registered taxpayers renewed timely, and that money was recovered by the Office of Finance through the renewal process. As opposed to that 82%, 18% of the business tax revenue generated in 2000-2001 fiscal year was due to Finance's discovery efforts. That 82%, however, over time has declined. And it's been a constant decline in terms of registered businesses that renew timely without any efforts from Office of Finance in terms of identifying them, discovering them. That number has declined to approximately 71% of total registered businesses that renew timely. And those businesses that they renew timely does not take any additional effort for finance to identify them, hold hearings, take collection action, and so forth. However, the amount of businesses that do not renew timely or that were not discovered at the present time, were not registered, and were discovered subsequently by Office of Finance has grown from 18% to 29%. So
I'm going to have to cut you off pretty soon because we're at the 10 o'clock hour for council. I think this is worthy of a longer discussion to dig into some of these stats, because I think Mr. Parks and I both have questions about whether or not, it sounds like you can probably disaggregate a lot of this data out. So let's put that together. We'll work with our CAO and CLA on what that list is, and maybe schedule that for one of our final looks in the committee at this. Let me just say this to BTAC. We already had our public comments for this item earlier, so we're going to have to cut off and go to the council meeting right now. But I want to just thank BTAC. This is a great report. This, if I can say, you kind of went, and I say this in a positive way, from being flamethrowers to a controlled burn, to a way that we can actually go. I think all of us had the same instinct that we would like in an ideal world to axe the tax, but we also live in a political and economic and fiscal constrained world of what's the best and most doable way to get there. And I'm very impressed with the 15-year plan and moving that forward. What I want to do is strengthen the underpinnings of this, the pillars of this, get the response back from Blue Sky, if there is any at all, find a measure of elasticity that we can comfortably embrace and make those who are the guardians of the budget feel comfortable with, pull out a little bit so we can see what the impact of our past reform has been based on what the actual numerical growth of new companies has been, or the existing companies' expansion of economic activity based on those accounts that we'll work on with the Office of Finance, and look at doing that in the next few weeks so that we can forward a full package and recommendation from this committee to the council. I think even in tough budget times, these are doable numbers for us to be able to launch right away. That's my personal opinion on these, but I want to dig in a little bit deeper to make sure that we have as strengthened an argument from our side as possible, and looking at some of the questions that Mr. Parks and I had. So thank you, gentlemen, for your great work on this, and we will work together with the Office of Finance. And Mr. Parks, any last comments as well?
One thing I'd like to ask, if we could have the CAO, because the proposal that was given to us today is a remarkable change from the prior documents, is whether Blue Sky can give us an evaluation of today's report over the 15-year period, as it appears more in line with a tax code simplification versus over 15 years that gets to the same results of eliminating business tax. As opposed to the first proposal was, I think, 5 years, and basically moving over that period and getting rid of them. So I'd like to see, because it's such a remarkable change in recommendations, that Blue Sky gives us some information on it. The other thing I think it's important is the April 18th report by the CAO that talks about one of the questions we asked last week, or last meeting, was to go back and look at the changes we've made in the reduction in business tax we've done over the last several years. And it's kind of remarkable that they say we've done about $135 million worth of enacted tax relief, which they estimate that it increased the economic output by $645 million and created about 5,200 jobs and returned about $8.6 million worth of revenue. And so I think that's what I was concerned with, is that we have a fairly decent number of tax relief, but also determining what we got out of it. And I think what I think it identifies in my mind is that yes, we might create all that activity, but the difference is that all that money does not come to us. It goes to it populates a variety of other tax bases that we do not have total control, nor do we get total acceptance of. And so that's something I think is very important.
And we will find out, again, that was using the earlier multiplier, which we know is somewhere between 5 and 30 times lower than the multiplier from the study, one of the multipliers in the study that they showed themselves. So hopefully we'll be able to get maybe a recalculation of that as well. And I think part of that will be the Office of Finance statistics. So we do have a meeting next week. We will schedule, as part of this meeting, perhaps working with the Office of Finance, seeing if we can get some of those numbers and continue the momentum. Thank you all very much, and this meeting of the Jobs Committee is adjourned.
Councilman, you're continuing the item, right?
Yes,
CLA,
we'll
right?
continue. Sorry, thanks, and we'll continue this action.
Great.
Thank you.